but in the international context. Anyway, with that, thanks. Let's go on. Can we move on? Axel, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Edwin O'Neill, our CEO, said, it's an important event to us, and I'm really delighted to have been invited to come here, take the long way from Zurich and fly over here, because this is an important market, and it's really important to have the dialogue, with you as our key customers, prospect customers, brokers, and the community here. We are committed here at Zurich, and I'm pleased that I have the opportunity to speak a little bit about the topic. I also don't know too much about it, Tim, like you. What about risk? Risk is not what has happened. Risk is what might impact us in the future and has somewhat an impact on our strategy and our objectives, but it hasn't yet happened. And that's why risk normally, especially, and my topic is more from a global perspective, is always materializing in somewhat, Jesus, I haven't seen it coming. And my presentation is not to give any forecast, but maybe it's a little bit the framework that could shape the thinking about risk. What we said, I will briefly report back on the so-called Global Risk Report. That was the 9th edition this year, that Zurich is supporting together with 2 other companies, Swiss Re Marsh, and then also some academic institutions like the Wharton School, Oxford, Singapore State University. And I think the good thing on this report is, and you will see it, it's somewhat fact-based, yes, but it's also somewhat relevant because it's a kind of a perception survey that we did, and we did last year. We surveyed more than 700 executives worldwide, so you can say every survey is wrong, but when 700 or 750 executives across industry, across geographies develop a certain view, I think at least it's a view and has certainly some relevance. When you look to the Global Risk Report, and I think one of those key things is that we look to really risks in a broad time frame. It's roughly 10-year outward looking. And when you see here, we don't only look to, and when you look to normally surveys, especially for business people, this is all these economic risks that are very much at the top. The Global Risk Report takes a slightly different perspective, and I think it's the right perspective. It's not enough just to look, for example, to the economic environment. It's not enough just to look to fiscal crisis. It's not enough to look to growth or whatever. I think what makes it is really to look to the various dimensions. And there are 31 key risks, and I obviously don't walk you through in detail on all of those risks, but I think the important one is to see, look, there are somewhat economic risk. We should not underestimate, and I come back to this later, environmental risk, like weather-related risk, then geopolitical risk, like what we see now, what we saw happening, and you mentioned it, Crimea, that is somewhat geopolitical risks that might even go even further, and we should not underestimate, by the way, this event in terms of what it really could mean from a more geopolitical perspective, having maybe even some serious economic or other consequences. Then social risk, food crisis, pandemic. Nobody speaks about pandemic these days, but there are scenarios out that the pandemic could be really devastating, at least for certain regions, could even impact then some of the global economy. And the last one is certainly on the technological basis. So the interesting part is when you look to risks, and I would say even when you look to risk in a company setup, when you look to risk within a country, when you look to risk within the regions, it's always this type of dimensions that we need to keep in mind. A key feature, and maybe that is maybe again here, what are the 10 key risks that were analyzed and that were, among others, also brought to the surface through this survey of more than the 750 executives. So you see them a little bit in the order, and you see here again, we have on one hand, that's the blue shaded, this is more the economic risk. We have then more the red shaded, this is more, the societal, socio-political risks, and then the green one are more the environmental risks. And when you go through it and you just start to think and you start to combine, and I think that is one of the key themes you look to and say, look, financial crisis in key economy, yeah, we know this all coming from Europe, for example. Then you combine with, global governance failure or political or social instability, or you combine with a severe income disparity, you can suddenly see that there could be really surprising scenarios coming together. But these are some of the top 10 key risks that are perceived globally to have an impact on our lives on a going forward basis. A key feature of the Global Risk Report and a key way to look at this is in this kind of the network. It's when you look to risk, it's not enough just to look to a simple root cause analysis. It's always somewhat different things that are coming together in a really surprising matter, and then suddenly can cause, effects that are really surprising. And in this regard, we did some also scenario and some analysis. Let's speak briefly about, for example, nat cats or weather-related events. On one hand, subjectively, people have the impression they have increased over the last couple of years. Just look back what happened, 2 years ago in Japan with the tsunami that has then huge impact. And when you just think about this example, 2 years ago, the devastating events, earthquake that we saw in Japan, and suddenly, 2 days later, Europe starts to change energy policy. Germany starts to go first with it. Even Switzerland was following. That shows you, the interconnectivity is really amazing to see, and we need, I think, to develop a kind of a sensorium and a perspective on all of those interconnections. When you look to weather-related events, they are, depending on what time frame you take, they are either increasing or stable. When you look to, natural catastrophes on average over the last 250 years, it's hard to say that they have increased the same frequency. When you look over the time period of 10 or 15 years, there's seems to be some of the spike in terms of frequency. But it's not only the frequency that matters, it's in particular the impact or the effect that it has. And what we obviously are observing, that natural catastrophes seem to have, and in reality they have impacts that are today much more severe than they might have been maybe some 50 or 100 years ago. Why is this the case? There are two, I think, key elements. First of all, it's the value concentration. The world people are getting richer and richer. And obviously, when you have something, you can lose something. So the economic impact is, when you get hit, is enormous. And secondly, more and more people go and live on coastal areas. Today, we have roughly already 3 billion people that live off coastal areas. And coastal areas are, you take, for example, the belt of fire going, that is where we have earthquakes going from Japan through Australia, New Zealand, up to California. There we see a real accumulation of people living there and creating more and more wealth. The same is happening or has happened, for example, in Florida, where we have the famous US hurricanes. Most of the houses are exactly there where the most hurricane exposed areas are. So the wealth accumulation is increasing. People are moving more and more, for example, to coastal areas. Out of the 20 largest cities, 13 are already built along coastal areas. So that gives you a sense of what can really happen. And when you saw, for example, Superstorm Sandy 18 months ago hitting the East Coast, you see the huge devastation. And it was only a superstorm. It was not only a hurricane. So you take natural catastrophes as one element that could increase and could have effects on a going forward basis that go far beyond what the national economy could absorb. And you think about, how this could work together when we have an increasing, let's say, difficult economic environment or a coupled economic financial crisis. Already today we see a lack of public funds to go into infrastructure. Typically in the US, which is one of the richest countries in the world, infrastructure is somewhat, you just need to go to land in JFK in New York and take a taxi downtown. You see in what bad shape the infrastructure is. So you combine, a scenario of an economic crisis and a sudden huge weather-related event that could really cause, I think, dimensions of a risk that has been not really thought through and not really lived through over the last couple of years. In the Global Risk Report, we looked in particular to three different types of scenarios. One is, the instabilities in an increasingly multipolar world. So that is at the end of the day also, country risk or perceived country risk that we have, tensions that we see. For example, look to the Syria crisis that clearly shows you, that we have a lack of a kind of a global governance. Nobody can really intervene. Nobody can really influence what is ongoing there. We just saw, a new, I think we'll call it, a geopolitical crisis with what's happening in Crimea. And that can have some real significant consequences, not only from a geopolitical or maybe from a global economic perspective, but also from a more an industry perspective. When you look to the energy industry, it's very much at the forefront also from some political discussions. When you look to what happened, for example, now with the Crimea situation, Europe will be very much challenged on the energy policy that will have significant impact on energy producing companies. Our industry as well is very much affected by this trend, by this tension between one hand globalization and then country by country approaches. You just look to emerging regulatory regimes, how they get implemented, and we see on one hand, on the banking side, even on the insurance side, we see regulatory regimes that on one hand go and retrench from a country by country perspective. On the other hand, I think there's a need for kind of a global financial system that is working. The other one the second one is about the lost generation, and I will just go to another slide. And this third one is digital disintegration. So let me briefly speak to the generation lost. When you see this slide here, it's somewhat it's somewhat a scary slide. You see somewhat the race of unemployment globally. Globally, we have roughly some 400 million people, young people below 25 years that are out of a job. And when you see where this is going, you see somewhat, and I would take this one here as maybe a little bit the median. So this is here this is US and European Union, where hopefully it will go down a little bit. But on the upper end, you see Middle East, you see North Africa, you see the Southern European countries, country like Spain, well-developed country that has youth unemployment in excess of 40%, Italy in excess of 25%. Huge topic all over Europe. Then you see, obviously Southeast Asia, here the area, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, obviously in a much better shape. This is explosive because young people out of a job after training or education and haven't had a job for 4 or 5 or 6 years, they probably will never get a job anymore, because when the economy starts to pick up, or the younger generation will take over. When you are 30 plus and have never worked, that is very, very tough. So here I think there's a big issue coming together that needs certainly globally concerted efforts, state concerted efforts. Every company is asked here to contribute, as this is a real big topic. The other big topic I wanted to mention here is what we call digital disintegration. Obviously, with the NSA and all the data-related issues that we have seen, it seems to be somewhat on top of everybody's mind. Data security is a key topic going forward, and that will the nature of that topic is potentially completely changing. So far, we have seen companies that got hacked, and what is normally happening, it's one company that gets hacked. Tesco got hacked, and there were, I think, 80,000 customer records, including credit card, that somebody was accessing. That is devastating for the customers, that is devastating for this company, but somewhat, it doesn't kill the company, and the company can somewhat deal with it. So, cyber attacks so far were more on, on the company by company. I think what we would analyze here is to say the nature of the overall internet has completely changed. Today we speak about the Internet of the Things. Everything starts to connect it with everything else. I just in my apartment, I got now a new stereo, and this goes through the internet. I go into the apartment, click on, and then the music comes. It goes all through the internet. New cars will be all connected through the internet. Heating in a house might be all connected through an internet. Alarm to the police is all connected to the internet. The internet as such has been very, very stable so far, but is subject obviously also to potential attacks, because there are a whole industry that is today out. Part is state supported, part is private industry. It's an industry that causes in excess of $100 billion of costs every year, roughly $110 billion of cost, where people are professionally looking for, attacking something. And when you can attack, it's much more easier than to defend, because when you want to attack, for example, a system or a company, there are 100,000 ways how you can do it, but you cannot defend 100,000 ways. When I want to attack, I only need to have one target and one entry door to go in. When I need to defend everything. So cybersecurity and the Internet of the Things will create, on one hand, great benefits to everybody. I enjoy myself, with my smartphone to have access to everything online at any time. On the other hand, it creates new dependencies, and the internet as such, as a system, could be put at stake. And we can have scenarios where a breakdown of the internet as a system could have as devastating impacts, like, for example, we have seen in the financial crisis in 2008. And that's why cyber or data security, cybersecurity today is not only a technical problem, it's a real managerial and it's a human problem that needs to be addressed from a board perspective, from a country perspective, again, also from I would call it from a global perspective. So what are some of the learnings and some of the conclusions when we talk about global risks? Global risks are, that's the nature, risks are not stopping at large, big risks, a natural catastrophe, an economic crisis, a food crisis. They are not stopping at national borders. They transcend national borders. So on one hand, trust is a key ingredient. I think we as business leaders are asked what we are faced today. Certainly in Europe, in the US, is somewhat the mistrust of broad parts of the population towards the business community. So trust is a key thing. Long-term thinking is another key thing. And then certainly, collaborative, multi-stakeholder plan. Business needs to work together with academia, needs to work together with public offices. The World Economic Forum is one of those platforms that is bringing those various stakeholders together, but that's the way forward. So when we talk about global risk and the Global Risk Report, again, it's not about doing any forecast. A risk is always an opportunity, but it's making, transparent what are some of the key exposures we have on a going forward basis, and it's up to the business community and to the political community to really find ways how to deal it and how to address it. And that is one of, I think, the products or one of the solutions we would continue to like to discuss also with you here in South Africa. How can Zurich contribute to your individual undertaking to at least deal with part of what we have seen here as potential global risks that might affect, individual economies, whole regions, or even, broader based on a global basis. Thank you very much, and back to you, Tim.
Thanks very much. That was great, Chris. I'm.
This works much better when it's on, as such. And just while we're setting up, I just took note of two things in terms of risk, like global pandemics. They talk about bird flu. I thought that's what birds did do anyway, but that doesn't matter. And water crisis, and we call it a liquidity crisis. But anyway, be that as it may, what I want to talk about, there's a few things I want to talk about, and as we go down the list, it gets worse. Okay, so we first start off with the external policy risk that we see globally that's, I think, developing, and how that's impacting on South Africa, certainly as a risk factor. And then I want to talk about the 2008 inflection point that did occur in South Africa over and above the actual global financial crisis, and then talk about the elections that we're going to have, and maybe something that goes through, because I think there are quite big risks that we're now facing, and we actually at another crossroads at the country. But the first thing is, globally, what happened is that the beginning of last year, we had quantitative easing escalating to $85 billion a month. How much is $85 billion a month? Well, that's about 40 Gautrains a month, or 40 Gauteng freeway improvement programs a month. Okay, that's how much it is. It's an enormous amount of money, right, that's being put there. And that was the Fed underpinning the financial markets. And what we saw last year largely is the gold price came down and the bond yields went up. That's the US Treasury yields. And these are assets that you normally buy when you want to hide from risk, as a haven from risk. So both these assets weakened during that time. What happened is that during while they're putting the huge amount of quantitative easing in place, you could say the markets get some comfort from that. The markets are underpinned by that, and we go on to risk on. People take risks. So that's one of the reasons, even though the Fed is buying these assets, they're weakening, right? Because what's happening is that other people are selling those assets because they're going to buy shares and other risky assets. Now we start the tapering, where we're now going to start easing this up, and we immediately see the yields start coming down. In other words, the bond yields start to strengthen, US Treasury strengthen, the gold prices started to go up at least through to there, and we're starting to see the markets shift onto risk off mode. And the stock markets, well, they came off in January, but they've since risen because the Fed said we're going to be looking at the data, and the data's been weak. Why? Because of the weather. So they didn't tell us they were looking at the data and the weather, but nevertheless, they are looking at the weather as well. And we've had a weak data rally since then, but again, they're continuing the taper. All right, and at some stage, the taper will bite. This is the third taper. We've already gone through taper one, which was after quantitative easing one. That was taper cold turkey. The Fed and the authorities didn't like that world, and they came up with quantitative easing two. And they did, when that program finished, it was taper two, again, taper cold turkey. They didn't like that world, so they came up with quantitative easing three. At some stage, now they're trying to say, well, let's ease this down. 10 billion a month, let's see if we can ease it down slowly and see if we can get a soft landing. And I think what's going to happen at some stage, the taper's going to bite, they're going to get cold feet, and they're going to escalate their taper again. But the reason why they can't taper is, let's look at what's happening to debt. This is what's happening to debt over the long term. It is going exponential. In other words, and this is US government debt, and you can do the same with UK government debt, etc. They're all going exponential. In other words, the systemic debt is looking more and more Ponzi-like. So Madoff had a hell of a Ponzi scheme, but nothing to touch the Bernanke Greenspan Ponzi scheme. And we've already had a few things. There was the emerging market crisis. All right. In other words, emerging market crisis. We've had the tech bubble, and then we've also had the global financial crisis, which means I think we're on set for what I call monster four. In other words, the emerging market crisis, tens of billions of dollars at the time to bail out South Korea and Taiwan and those kind of eye-watering amounts at that particular time, and that then morphed into the dot bombs, the dot cons, the dot gons, whatever, where hundreds of billions were involved, and that morphed into the global financial subprime problem, where tens of trillions are involved. And the next crisis, well, is that hundreds of trillions? Anyway, we are progressing because effectively you can't taper a Ponzi. Okay, and I think at some stage we're going to land up with the big one. You could say that crisis was when the too big to fail actually failed, and this crisis is maybe when the central banks fail. In other words, policy no longer works. You know, whatever quantitative easing you like doesn't actually work. So that's there. It's not a case of the glass half full or glass half empty. This is the glass breaking. Okay, so that's basically the difference. And that's fed back into emerging markets, and we find ourselves in what's called the Fragile Five. South Africa is part of the Fragile Five club. It's only emerging markets that are part of the Fragile Five. And why is it the Fragile Five? It's because of a twin deficit problem. Okay? So the twin deficit problem then feeds back into the currency. That's the first port of call, is macroeconomic instability that comes with the twin deficit problem. And so you've had the currencies, the rand, the Indian rupee, etc., all weakening to last year, and it was weakening during risk on. And that's where the thing is, when the taper bites, do we see these currencies just escalate its weakness just for that particular time? And that's basically what I would say, is that at some stage in the next few months, whether it's the sell in May and go away, it's maybe calamity May and go away or something like that, you know, with the markets, you may well find that the rand, Indian rupee, etc., do weaken. Who are the Fragile Five? It's basically South Africa, Turkey, Brazil, India, and Indonesia. Why? Because they've got a current account deficit. In other words, their deficit with the rest of the world, or the relationship with the rest of the world is in deficit, and their governments have a deficit as well. South Africa, we can identify a third major deficit, and that's the households that are also in deficit. And so I think we've got a triple deficit problem. But you'll notice that there's some very important countries that are left out. I thought you know, the finance minister was actually quite apt when the developed market, you know, economic or ministers of finance are telling the emerging markets to get their house in order. These are the people that caused the global financial crisis, and they're telling the emerging markets to get their house in order. What a cheek. The only trouble is the emerging markets have to get their house in order. That's the trouble, all right, because of the deficits. And the deficits are actually quite big, all right. And if they're not solved, you'll see more and more macroeconomic instability. But it's macroeconomic instability. It's not sovereign solvency, right, which is like your Greece, etc. In other words, the countries are not bankrupt, all right. South African, you know, and that's the joy of living in a country where the government is solvent. Okay, I know they're trying hard to change it, but the government is solvent, and well within that. All right, and basically, you do have opportunities in terms of assets. Things like rand-head shares will do well if the rand weakens, and we've already seen that starting off. It's not like Greece where the markets collapse 90% or more, and there isn't a single asset class that gives you protection in a country where the government actually goes bankrupt, as we saw in Greece. But geopolitical risk, it's already been touched on, is one of those things that's been a curiosity up until now. You just take a look at something like the Middle East, right? This is 5 years ago. Largely a stable region with only 2 civil wars. The Americans were trying very hard you know, to stabilize things, or that's their story, and they'll stick to it. But 5 years down the line, this region has become unstable, all right? And so far, Syria is Syria. It's contained within Syria, and you think, okay, it's sad and it's not great. But at some stage, the potential for a geopolitical event that is globally disruptive, in other words, a major war, something like that, is there. All right, if that Straits of Hormuz, for instance, decides to be closed by whoever, you know, goes mad at the time, it doesn't really matter. The oil price is $200 very, very quickly. And that has an impact on prices. But that's not the only place. We've already mentioned Crimea. Okay? As I say, who knew it existed? But wait till you start to hear about Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and all of those funny places, because they've all got Russian minorities in there. And these are the old, what they call communist, or the old Soviet republics. Russia was the dominant Soviet republic, and one of their big things is they don't want foreign domination. They've fought with all of their neighbors over the centuries, etc. But you have had very serious invasions, Napoleon, Hitler, etc. So the Russians are quite sensitive about these sort of things, and they want large buffer zones, and they want to actually bring these areas back within their sphere. So these are areas where Russians have got very significant proportions of the population, and this looks very much like the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia and Hitler in 1938. Oh, there's Germans living here. They should be part of Germany. Thank you very much. And then you say, well, why should you exist at all? And then we'll just take you over and that kind of thing. And so we are seeing that geopolitical risk. We've got more. These are not the only places, but here you've got these two funny little islands between China and Japan. Basically, you've got China and Japan. How could you say they're no longer China's? And they're busy, potentially fighting or going to actually fight over that type of thing. And that's potentially disruptive because South Africa is now part of BRICS. Okay? Now, what do we do? For instance, Russia and Crimea. Russia is part of the BRICS. What do we do from a foreign policy point of view? All right, do we go expedience or principled? Right, where do we go if China and Japan have a fat fight? China might be our biggest trading partner, but Japan's a far more important trading partner and investor in South Africa, if you actually look at the brands and that kind of thing and the value of that actual trade, with the investment that actually comes in. So it's one of those things we have to be careful. But of course, in South Africa, we were hit in 2008 by the global financial crisis. Now, the thing about the global financial crisis is that it was global. It hit the world. Okay, it didn't just hit South Africa, but when these things happen, they are manna from heaven for politicians, because here you've got an external event that you can blame everything on. So let's have a look. Here we've got unemployment, Brazil and South Africa. Unemployment. Now, the levels are completely different. Here, South Africa's 32%, Brazil only starting off at about 13%. And we have a lovely period from 2001 or so onwards where unemployment is coming down. And then the global financial crisis hits. And so what happens to unemployment? And remember, the global financial crisis hit Brazil as well. And this is what happens, and this is astonishing, is that it keeps going down. There was a little blip in 2008 in Brazil, but it keeps coming down. Whereas in South Africa, it's actually higher now. So one of them's the odd one out. So which one is the odd one out? So you check what happened in Colombia, what happened in Turkey, what happened in Thailand. In other words, similar countries to South Africa in terms of size and that type of thing. And you find they're all coming down. South Africa is the odd one out. So something else happened in 2008 other than the global financial crisis. And let's call that Polokwane. Okay? So this is where the politicians amongst us either get very cross with me or they have a little giggle because they know what I'm talking about. There's a little shift to the left every sort of few years. And now we can now look back and see, after all the efforts, we sit last year with 1.9% growth, way below our peers, way below our neighborhood, etc. And we've got to actually ask, well, what is the actual issue? And the inflection point comes in a number of ways. For instance, just on interest rates. Through the 2000s, you had the cycles. All right, these were interest rates coming down. You had the cycles again, but largely economic growth rates coming up. This was the TM cubed factor. You know who TM cubed is? Tito Mboweni, Trevor Manuel, and Thabo Mbeki. That's TM cubed. Okay, so that's there. All right, so TM cubed was in charge. You then have Polokwane. At the same time, you have the global financial crisis. TM cubed gets pushed out, and here you've got interest rates continuing to come down, and growth rate keeps coming down. Again, you can see that inflection point. You can see the inflection point with debt. For instance, here we have the debt to GDP ratio coming down, right down to the low, the middle 20%, and the debt levels are, these are the overall debt levels, and the debt, even though the debt to GDP ratio was coming down, the debts were still going up during Trevor Manuel's time, because when Trevor Manuel was the Minister of Finance, he had a very good friend that always assisted him with his budgets called Mr. Inflation. We never notice him. When the budget gets delivered, he's standing right next to the Minister of Finance. Anyway, but since then, and the Minister, Pravin Gordhan, has actually said, we've borrowed R1 trillion to stabilize the economy, to keep spending up so that we have counter-cyclical fiscal policies. And what we've done is we've spent our way into the fragile five. That's what we've done. Okay, so it's we've striked our way into the fragile five, with the deficit. So these are things that are very fixable, because I think the underlying fundamentals in South Africa are in fact quite strong. But on that sort of basis, right, we now then say, what happens as we approach the election? And it's actually quite interesting, because we're getting to the point of what are called maximum pessimism. We've had the weak rand. The weak rand's like a salary cut. I hope you all enjoyed your salary cut. Okay? With it comes higher petrol price. I hope you're really enjoying filling up your cars these days. Fabulous times and all the rest of it. And you've got the interest rate hike. I hope you're all enjoying your mortgage these days, and you're probably going to get another hike today. Well, that would be my call. If you don't get a hike now, you'll certainly get another 2 hikes, by the third quarter. In any case, all of these things take money out of our pockets, and the economy is too weak to put it back into our pockets. So we're going to experience a bit of hardship, and that brings us to what I call the point of maximum pessimism, because these things also go in cycles. And if you could just bear with me in terms of the economic cycles, just a simple little thing in terms of economic cycle, the interrelationship. We can start with the rand, because that's sort of in our face the most. If you find that the rand weakens, what happens? It filters through into higher producer inflation. That then filters through into higher consumer inflation, and that puts Jill Marcus into a bad mood, and she hikes interest rates. And when she hikes interest rates, takes money out of our pocket, and that demand in the economy drops, and that means economic growth drops. And because demand is dropping, we import less, and that means the trade balance starts to close, and that takes pressure off the balance of payments, leading to a stronger rand. And the stronger rand then filters through into lower producer inflation. And then that filters through into lower consumer inflation. It puts Jill Marcus into a good mood. She cuts interest rates. We go shopping. Economic growth goes, starts to pick up, and we start importing more, and the trade balance starts to deteriorate, putting pressure on the balance of payments. And that cycle lasts roughly 2 to 2.5 years. And you can see where we are at the moment. We're busy seeing with the rate hikes, etc. In the next few months and etc., you'll see the trade balance improve. And by the end of the year, the economy is in an upward cycle. And that's why I'm saying by the middle of the year, that's the point of maximum pessimism, just at the time of the election. And the trouble is when you're fighting a weak election, an election with a weak economy, the politicians start promising things. And they start turning this into an auction. If they that lot promise you this lot are going to promise you that. Out of your pockets. As taxpayers, you've got to run a mile when this happens. All right? Fortunately, the budget wasn't like that. And I would commend the Minister of Finance enormously as to a budget that was actually very, very sensible, given those circumstances. However, is that upward cycle a strong upward cycle or a weak upward cycle? Do we go for what's called the Washington Consensus, a more open economy that's that actually has traction on growth? Or do we go what I'm calling a Beijing consensus? In other words, the Chinese model, which is very alluring. Now, the Chinese model is seen as that you've got this strong central government that is able to direct things, and this is why they're getting the growth. And that's the wrong lesson to learn from China, because China's economic growth is actually Washington consensus. It's actually opening up the economy. It's less of Mao. When, Mao Chairman Mao was running the economy until he died, he did China a huge favor by dying, because by that stage you could then bring in reformists. And when the reformists came in, they started pulling back their communism. And when they started to pull back that orthodox communism and started freeing the economy, that gave the catalyst for growth. Not the central planning. It wasn't more central planning that got them where they are. It was less. And that's the lesson. India, the same thing. They reach a crisis in 1991, and they're forced to abandon this hardcore socialism like the license Raj and all the rest of it, this tangle of red tape that they had, etc. And it's the freer economies that actually is what got the growth going. But we've got the wrong lesson. And we've got another problem called Jacob Zuma. Okay? And basically, we've had an Nkandla report, but it's not the own problem. And this is where the politics actually lands up at a crossroad. Right. Do we take decisions of experience? And again, there's a damn election here that's there. Or do we take decisions that are based on integrity? Because basically, this is where we'll fall. Do we shift into what I would call as a dirty democracy? We still have elections and all that, but it's a nasty democracy where you've got the skullduggery in place, the lack of trust, etc., because of the rot that's occurring. It's a very difficult. Watergate was a minor scandal compared to what's happening in South Africa. All right, Watergate. The info crisis, remember that, which dislodged John Forster. That was a minor thing. That's like the New Age, that sort of thing. It's the same sort of thing. But that's not even a crisis or thing these days. Or do we still shift to a great democracy where it's ruled by consent, etc., and you've got free, transparent, open processes? The budget process, for instance, is rated as one of the best budget processes in the world. Well, one or two, if you rate that in terms of transparency and openness and the effectiveness of that. There's an enormous amount of pluses. These things start to go with this. So this is a case of what will the response be, and what's then the impact on the business and the economy? Do you actually see a strong growth or weak growth? Am I over time? Yes, I am. But it's not too much more. So that then brings me to what the election result may be. As middle-class people, it's very difficult to understand why you've got people protesting in the streets against service delivery, and we get something like 32 service delivery protests a day. That's a lot, all right? And then they all still vote for the ANC anyway. How does that work? And one needs to understand it's not irrational at all. It's extremely rational. Because if you understand the electoral value chain, the struggle and the custodianship of the struggle is the most valuable electoral asset, if you like, and the most valuable issue in the minds of the voters. Bread and butter issues, service delivery issues are way down. And the reason one wouldn't understand is in a middle-class environment, one wouldn't have even noticed the sirens going off at 9 o'clock where blacks had to be off the street and that kind of rubbish. And that living through that, so people are happy. We'll vote ANC and protest for our service delivery. That's basically what the strategy is at the moment, is because of that scar called apartheid, which is actually deeply entrenched. And that's basically what we have to deal with. However, the service delivery issues and bread and butter issues, the gap between the value of that and the struggle is widest in your older generation and narrower in your younger generation. And this is where you'll start to see the changes is, firstly, by the time this election is a struggle election, okay, where the struggle will count the most. And so expect the ANC to get 62 to 63% of the vote. That would be my call, okay? They'll get that, but by the next election, you'll have large bodies of voters. If the economy does not perform between now and the next election, you'll find that the value proposition starts to transpose, that bread and butter issues and service delivery issues become more important for an urban voter that's now largely, you could say, the born frees. In other words, the majority born free, majority urban, and you get that potential for that enormous swing that you see in African politics. And that's going to be interesting to see how much of a swing we get now. Because when that starts to happen, the other risk that the ANC has is if corruption affects the voters' perception, even if the struggle issues are the most valuable, if they don't regard the ANC as the best custodian of the struggle because of corruption issues. So those are the two risks. So you pull back corruption and you have a decent economy between now and 2014 and 2019, and the ANC will be unassailable in 2019. But if you have this morass of corruption and lack of service delivery and a poor economy struggling to 2019, they will be at risk. That's an election that they will be at serious risk of actually losing. And that's basically the choice that they have. Do you actually choose to say, let's now clean our act up, start reducing corruption, bring in a new leader, and actually have a very strong end of the year upward trajectory or not? And that's basically what we have. This election, what's going to be the interesting thing is that there are 3 provinces in play. The Western Cape, you could say, is safe DA, and that's where I think the ANC loses a bit further ground, because they're fighting the DA on their strength, not on the ANC strength, and that's something. I think the DA actually planted Maurice Fransman in the ANC to do that as their best friend, as such. But Gauteng, there was a report that I saw anyway that the opinion polls are suggesting that supporters dropped. There's been a number of own goals like e-tolls and Beckersdal and that kind of thing, and even Marikana, where the police are starting to shoot people and that. And you may well get a hung legislature. I don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to take it, but with a reduced majority. And the Northern Cape, apparently the opinion polls at this stage are also suggesting an under 50%. And there again, if it does happen, you'll probably have a DA or DA-COPA coalition. But if you have a hung legislature in Gauteng, it's going to be ugly, because it'll be DA, EFF, ANC. Now, who pairs up with who is going to actually be very, very interesting. And so basically, one needs to appreciate that this is going to be an interesting election, but it's not going to be a groundbreaking election. I believe it's going to be pretty much the same, but there are tectonic shifts taking place if we go business as usual between 2014 and 2019. That's where the big changes will take place, and that's where it will really become interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Something just struck me. I know it's probably occurred to everybody in the room years ago, but I do think one of the interesting things about both presentations is how much data is a sort of combator of risk, and really your only tool in understanding risk is more data. And so thank you for the data that you given. And could we have some more? Thank you, Sharon.
Nice, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, after that, I'm feeling a bit pessimistic. I'm not sure about yourselves, but it's how do we lift ourselves from that? And No, and I think that that's the reality. And as risk workers, as I am, and representing a institute of risk professionals, there is hope. And I think the hope is that there are ways for corporate South Africa, any organization in South Africa, to have to confront what we are faced with, and we have to deal with it. I mean, that's the opportunity, even in the crisis, which I think it is, that we are faced with. What I'd like to demonstrate, and you will see a lot of the connection between the talk of Axel and of Chris, is the interconnectivity of the risks. I would strongly recommend the reading of that report. It's absolutely fascinating reading, and it's a long report, but take it to bed with you, and it really is a deserving bedtime reading. And here, the dominant matter that came through for me was the impact of systemic risk and the interconnectivity of those risks, and you're going to see that right through my presentation. In fact, I can't move through quick enough through my slides to show you and demonstrate that interconnectivity that exists. But as risk workers, it's the absolute importance in people who lead organizations to understand that knock-on effect. We cannot just take what we see right in front of us. We've got to look at what the impact is right throughout that series of events. We've spoken a lot about the political situation, and in here, there's so much that one can speak about here, the corruptions, the reputation risk. Our two ladies up there, goodness knows what they were thinking at the time. And we all know Juju there and what he gets up to. And each one of them needing to manage a risk of their own and of their parties, and the reputation that is key to everybody. But the associated matters are very important here. What will the policy changes be? Banks, for example, very concerned about nationalizations, as are the mines. So again, the knock-on effect of what our political changes might be as we face them. And then the good news for me, and it was mentioned by Chris, a budget that was put in place, and a very thoughtful one. As bankers, we are very proud of our regulators, and I demonstrate that through the financial crisis, which we believe as a financial industry we got through quite nicely, because in part of the strength of our regulator. They're very strict. They watch us, they monitor us, they are good watchdogs, and they have very, very strict laws and regulations that we've got to follow. We stand by the National Treasury. We believe that they employ an array of very skilled people, and they really know what they're doing. And personally, very, very, very grateful that our revenue is in fact collected. Imagine if we didn't have the funds available to keep our country going as it is. And then just down there at the bottom, something out of interest, there's an organization that is funded by the banks called SABRIC. It's a joint initiative where this group of people, it's a non-profit organization, make a very, very big contribution to ensuring that crime, financial crime, cash heists, ATM frauds, internet crime, and cyber crime is taken care of in the country and monitored so that these really great threats that could face us are managed to within a reasonable threshold. So I've spoken a bit about us coming through the financial crisis, and I know that will probably contradict it, but we do believe as banks that we came through it a little bit less scathed than a lot of the other countries around the world. And we believe that there was good leadership at the time. I've spoken about the strict regulators. Our exchange control laws, you can't just pack up and leave with everything that you have. And some of our credit policies endorsed by the National Credit Act were a little bit more stringent than those of, say, the United States, where it was a massive going and buy your home, and we know the trouble that landed up there. And then the question that I pose is, in this country, I really do believe that in places we are already practicing really good risk management. We spoke of corruption just now, and government's inability to implement. So our taxes are collected, we have the money, but when it comes to that implementation, they're just not getting it right. And that's demonstrated in some of the slides that will follow now. The lack of investment in infrastructure, and was it yourself who said that they didn't know much about risk? I think it was you, Tim. You're managing risk daily. You're avoiding potholes in South Africa. And this is related to those extreme weather. In South Africa, we've had a taste of extreme weather just lately in Gauteng, where those storms and the rainfall that we had were rather out of kilter with what we have become accustomed to experiencing. And with that demise in the inability to spend those budgets and keep our roads as they should be, we've been suffering on a level that is causing a lot of, we're seeing productivity falling, people can't get to work, taking a long time to get to work, distress levels, people are stressed, taking a long time to get to work. Sewage pipes, I'm told that they should be 800 millimeters in diameter, they're 300 millimeters in diameter. We're about to get into a huge crisis there. Speaking to engineers while I was preparing this presentation that manage risk for one of the larger engineering firms in South Africa, they were just saying that they feel the soul has gone out of the engineers' desire to do what they need to do from a perspective of keeping our infrastructure as it should be. And why is that? Why are they losing that hope? We all know the traffic issues that we experience, that inability just to keep things as they should be. Then we spoke about the protests, the protests. And the unemployment, the ability of the youth to be able to use the social media to their advantage, and the risk of that. How quickly would they be able to mobilize? And the 32 a day, I was startled at that number. I didn't realize it was that high. But what happens if they mobilize to the point that an Arab Spring might be possible in South Africa? Again, related to that, the unemployment, the underemployment, and the bored children. Poverty, escalating crime, the cyber and electronic fraud. Our overcrowded prisons. Crime takes place, they may be arrested if we're lucky, thrown in jail, and then a slow judicious process. And then do they stay in jail or just repeat it and get put back into overcrowded prisons? Now, from a bank's perspective, you might find this very interesting, but on average, we've experienced an increase of 34% in new legislation. From the period of 2009, an increase of 215% in the number of new regulations that we've got to comply with. That's extremely onerous. You can imagine the impact on resourcing, on our processes, on our products, on our systems, the changes that have got to be made for us to be able to comply with those. And then our regulators often come in to ensure that we are giving effect to those, many of them being very, very difficult to achieve in the timelines that are required. We've spoken about our currency decline and some of the ways that that can be improved and the cycle that it follows. The climate change, I'm not going to spend much time on there. The threat of terrorism acts and consequences thereafter. Now, we don't see all that much of that anymore, thank goodness. However, the bombing of the Kenyan Mall, the consequences that followed up from that with the implications of a South African woman having ties to South Africa and the money laundering connection, that has had a huge impact on the South African banks and the investigations that have had to follow. The increased demand for unsecured lending, people, the availability of credit, although the assurance here is that our regulators have been quite firm on the banks as well, and those unsecured portfolios have been brought to book, and there's a conscious effort by the banks to reduce their unsecured lending portfolios. Threatening wars, what do they mean to us? The unresolved mysteries, and here really I included this for, do we understand the risk here? Will you and I be affected by this? Is it something to do with the aviation industry? Are the controls reducing there? Do they really understand the cause? They don't, we know that. But what's the risk? Who's going to fix what's wrong here? Social media, reputation risk, we spoke a little bit about that through here. And then the protection of personal information. Huge, huge work to be done by organizations, and in particular banks, insurance companies, on protecting people's information, hospitals, medical information that has to be protected. And here we know exactly the lifetime it's taken for some of these people to build their reputations and how quickly they were able to lose them. So very important for all of us to manage those reputations, and especially organizations. Organizations, and in banks in particular, can be brought to their knees with the smallest of rumors. Directors' greed. Directors going to jail. We spoke a little bit about Madoff when Chris was speaking. Cruel in his ways and the impact on people. I always believe that if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is, and a good way to live. Again, the knock-on impact here, the growing dissatisfaction by the younger people and the differential, the income disparity, they're not going to stand for that too much longer. So hence we see the increased requirements of organization to disclose remuneration, remuneration committees controlling the size of bonuses, and people being held account for the mistakes that are happening and the big losses that organizations are experiencing. And I think in time to come, we're going to see many, many more being marched off to jail. Good governance. I really do believe that post all the events, and especially post 2009, we have a plethora of guidance that is available to us as organizations. And if we take what is meant by the true spirit of those codes, there's good stuff to be had there. As far as banks are concerned, we have Basel. And if your bank has used that to its maximum advantage and got real smart people to put that in place, the organizations are really enjoying good value from that. Controls have been improved. Capital is now worked out in an absolute manner. And an amount of that is being able to be released back into the organization to spend on other amounts. So the amounts are no longer fixed at certain percentages. You can demonstrate to your regulator what capital you need to be holding. Just for interest's sake, and just to show you, because I found it so interesting when I went through that report that Axel went through with us, is just to show you what, as a bank, the research that we do, these are the top 10 risks that we see. Other than those that we are required to manage by the regulations, the big one, of course, being credit risk, which in our organization comprises about 70% of our risk portfolio, and then liquidity being the next one, and liquidity and market risk being the next one, and our operational risk. So liquidity, market risk about 14%, and the balance being the operational risk. But those are the other ones that we've got to be really very mindful of as we manage a bank. And this is really where I was going to pose the challenge and hope that we can introduce some of the optimism. If you're a leader of your organization or a manager of a business or a function in your organization, do you have a firm view on what's keeping you awake at night? And then more important than that, are you tabling those concerns at your executive committee or with your board? Have you explored whether or not your organization has capacity to withstand the happening of a catastrophic event or one of those events that's really keeping you awake at night? Is it necessary for you to manage the risk down to a more acceptable level should the event materialize by reducing the risk by either adding more controls or resources, or if sufficiently untenable, should you be terminating that risk? Is there an open culture and a transparent culture of upward reporting encouraged in your organization? Will your staff celebrate the achievements and the success of the organization, as well as those things that might be lurking under the murky waters that can cause you harm? What about your risk management philosophy? Does your board and your executive aspire to practicing the good risk management that we speak of? And better yet, are they striving to have world-class management practices? Do they set the right tone? Are they setting aside sufficient management time to reflect on the emerging risks and to the upside and the downside of the risks associated with all the developments that we've described this morning? What about lessons learned when bad things happened, and regrettably they do? Are the pitfalls understood and dealt with in a constructive manner to prevent a repeat thereof? Is awareness heightened of what can go wrong and does go wrong, so as to widen the knowledge of the potential risks? Is that demonstrated by management and the board's consideration of emerging and evolving risks. Is responsibility and accountability for managing risks very clearly defined? Does the board understand what they need to be doing? Does the line management understand what they need to be doing? Are there second line of defense functions where you have pure risk focus roles? And then are you using your assurance providers in the form of your internal and external auditors to give you the assurance that you're wanting? What about scorecards? Is risk management included in the scorecards? The charters of your committees, do they have risk as a focus? Are people appraised on their performance? What happens when things go wrong? Are they seen to for that too? And lastly, are you using the likes of the consultants that we've heard with these reports like this morning? They have the experience, and I think that we all learn from them. I certainly have this morning, and I thank you for your attention.
Shirley, thank you very much. Shirley tells me that the Institute is starting to accredit risk officers, and I think that's a great development, and I really think it does deserve support. We're running a little bit over time, but we do have opportunity for some questions. If you would like to ask anything of any of the panelists, please give us a shout. Is there anything? Does anyone want to? All right then. Can I? The new head of global corporate in Zurich is Christoph. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Leutzinger? Leutzinger. Ah, not too bad. Not too close, at least. Can you please close off for us? Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen. It does work better when it's on. Yes, thanks, Chris. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard a lot about risk, about the interconnectivity of risk, and also the global impact and implications about risk today. So just to very briefly sum up, I would like to elaborate about 2 points with regards to the relevance for the insurance industry. Point number 1 is when we look at the emergence of new risks, like the cybercrime, for example, it is very important for the insurance industry to be able to provide solutions for companies, for the customers, to cover such new risks. Second point, with regards to the global impact of risk events, it is very important that the insurance industry is able to cover such risks globally, to provide certainty of cover, meaning also that certain risks must be covered and evidence of cover must be issued locally, and the respective taxes must be paid locally in accordance and compliance with local tax regulation and also insurance regulation. Before handing back to Ting to close off, I would just like to mention that following this event, we have a demonstration of the Zurich Risk Room, which is a global country risk analysis tool to help companies who want to invest in new regions and new geographies to assess the business, economic, and political risks. Understand that there are a couple, very few, of seats left. So if anyone is interested without having applied for it earlier, please let me know. Thank you very much, and back to Tim.
Thanks very much. I think it's been really fascinating. Thank you all for coming. It's been absolutely great. And most of all, can I say thank you to Nandi and Tilo for putting this whole event together. Really, our speakers have been great. Thanks very much.